Pirates, Opium and Good Neighbours, how Solovyov justifies the current war by rewriting the history of Britain and Europe. About Ukraine, without Ukraine, how Solovyov's show rewrites war and peace against the backdrop of Witkoff and Kushner's shuttle diplomacy in Moscow. Vladimir Solovyov's program performs a familiar task, transforming a complex and ambiguous situation into a black and white picture, where Russia is the only rational and moral actor, and Ukraine is simultaneously the West's puppet, the main villain, and a helpless victim. This segment is interesting because it directly links to Putin's interview with an Indian television channel. The TV presenter not only recounts the president's talking points, but builds an entire ideological corpus around them. 1. The plan is peaceful, but the picture is warlike. The starting point is the same, 27 to 28-point Trump plan, divided into 4 packages. Solovyov emphasizes that the document is being discussed in Moscow. Kyiv, he says, is completely in the dark and is only eager for a meeting with the Americans to find out what has already been decided. This is how the key narrative is constructed. The subjects are Russia and the United States, in Solovyov's version, Putin and Trump personally. Europe is an obstructive, hysterical chorus in the background. Ukraine is the object that, at most, will be presented with a fait accompli. At the same time, the presenter immediately returns the viewer from the topic of negotiations to the topic of victory. Parliamentary sources from Kyiv are quoted as if the Ukrainian armed forces are experiencing a disaster. The number of conscientious objectors allegedly exceeds the pre-war strength of the army. And the regime, despite this, relies on Europe and still will not prevent Russia from achieving its goals. Peace in this logic is not an alternative to war, but a way to consolidate what has already been achieved and legitimize further expansion. And right now in Ukraine, and in Ukraine, by the way, in Europe, there's a lot of this hysteria, these really catchy articles. I think Vladimir Vladimirovich sees them more than anyone else. The articles they're talking about, but the talks in Moscow didn't end in anything. And what did you want the talks in Moscow to end in? No, how do they know how the talks ended? It's so extreme. That's the beauty of it. You can't imagine what a mess they've made, what they've done in the Kremlin, and Putin's happy with the talks, and Trump's happy, and they're both happy, and they're not saying anything to anyone. Can you imagine the horror? And the people are panicking. It's just terrifying. They can't find a place for themselves. So what should we do now? Invent what was said there, refute it ourselves, smear it ourselves, and shout, "We won." These are the times. 2. Donbas and administrative borders as sacred territory. Solovyev then broadcasts Putin's explanation of the history of the recognition of the People's Republics. The line is simple. For 8 years, Moscow patiently tried to improve relations between Kyiv and Donbas. When it realized that they were simply being destroyed, it was forced to recognize, and not within the borders that were actually controlled on the ground, but within the full scope of the Soviet-Ukrainian administrative borders. For an outside observer, 2 things are important. First, this is a retrospective legitimization of maximalist territorial claims. What international law and most states consider an illegal annexation is described within the Russian studio as a forced and morally justified reaction. Secondly, a stark binary choice is created for the future. Either Russia liberates these territories militarily, or the Ukrainian armed forces withdraw on their own. Any other option, for example, a compromise on borders, an international format, or gradual demilitarization, is deliberately excluded from the possible options. 3. Ours kills ours, a radical role. Reversal, the most difficult part, is the detailed description of the alleged systematic killing of civilians by the Ukrainian army in the territories where Russian troops are advancing. Here, the usual propaganda tropes are used. Emotional scenes of shot families, mangled bodies, people being led through minefields. A clear contrast, Russian drones extract civilians, while Ukrainian drones finish off the wounded. An emphasis on the fact that all these people hold Ukrainian passports and until the very end were considered Ukrainian citizens. The message for Russian and, by extension, European viewers is simple. In these territories, the Ukrainian state is the occupier and the Russian army is the liberator, to whom people are trying to break through, risking their lives. Any real questions, who exactly fired, what happened on the ground, whether there is independent verification, aren't raised in the show's format. Instead of discussing the severity of the fighting and the vulnerability of civilians in the zone of intense combat, viewers are offered a ready-made moral judgment. Kyiv is deliberately turning the Donbas and Kharkiv Oblast into a scorched desert and killing those trying to escape to the Russian side. Think, analyze, draw conclusions, and don't be fooled. This was the program Empire of Lies.